Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the worldview of a pretty controversial figure, the traditionalist writer Elwin Ransom. We're going to use his own words, his own writings, to map out exactly what he believes.
So let's start with a really provocative question. What if the modern world is just built on a lie? Now, for Elwin Ransom, this isn't just some edgy what if. No, this is the bedrock of his entire belief system. He's making a radical argument here that pretty much everything about our modern world, our systems, it's all fundamentally broken and, in his words, totally hostile to objective truth.
This quote right here, this is the whole thing in a nutshell. We're going to circle back to it, I promise, because it's kind of the key that unlocks his entire way of thinking. But to get what he's even talking about, we first have to understand his diagnosis. What exactly does he think is so wrong with the world? Okay, so here's his main claim. Ransom believes we're living in a time that has completely given up on any real search for truth. And for him, this didn't just happen by mistake. Oh no, he thinks it was built this way, on purpose, by a very specific group of people.
He calls them the cult of experts. It's a term he came up with to describe what he sees as like a new priesthood. He's arguing that whether you're talking about science or the media, there's this tiny group of elites who get to decide what's true. And they're not deciding based on facts or evidence, but on consensus. A consensus that he argues they basically manufacture just to keep themselves in power.
And this right here, this is the main event. It's the central conflict in Ransom's entire worldview. You've got two opposing forces. On one side, objective truth, which to him is divine. It's eternal. It comes from God. And on the other side, you've got consensus truth, a fake, man-made version that he says is just controlled by the elites. This is the battleground. Everything else he talks about stems from this fight.
So if you believe all that, where do you go from there? Well, for Ransom, it leads to a total rejection of, well, everything. The entire modern political and social order. I mean, if you think the foundation is completely rotten, you're not going to try to patch up the walls, right? You condemn the whole building.
You know, we're often taught that history is a story of progress, right? Things getting better and better. Ransom sees the exact opposite. For him, it's a story of steady decline, a fall from a golden age of traditional hierarchical society. He points to these key moments. First, the French Revolution, which he says invented this idea of nationalism tied to the state. Then comes modernism, which put human reason and science above God. And finally, postmodernism, which he thinks just blew everything up, got rid of all norms and left this vacancy, this big empty void of chaos. This quote really gets to the heart of his problem with democracy. He's basically saying that democracy is evil because when you vote, you're giving your stamp of approval to the government. You become complicit. You share the guilt for what he calls its sins. So in his mind, the only morally correct thing to do is to not participate at all.
Okay, so you've got this system you think is just pure evil. What do? You don't try to fix it from the inside. That's not his game at all. Instead, he lays out this three-part strategy: embrace, extend, and exterminate. The idea is, first you embrace modernity's own tools and ideas. Then you extend them. You push them to their most extreme logical conclusion until they basically self-destruct. And then, when it all comes crashing down and creates that vacancy he talks about, you exterminate the old and replace it with a new, or actually a very, very old traditional Christian order.
So you can see how rejecting the entire system leads to a pretty stark political view. I mean, if you throw out the idea of debate or finding common ground, politics gets a whole lot simpler and a whole lot harsher. He borrows this from the political theorist Carl Schmitt, and it's key. For Ransom, all of politics, everything, boils down to one simple distinction: friend versus enemy. And his definition of a friend is very specific. It's someone who's on your team ethnically, culturally, and religiously. Anyone who doesn't fit that description, well, they're potentially an enemy. You really have to get this concept to understand where he's coming from. And that friend-enemy logic, well, it goes somewhere pretty dark. It leads him to justify political violence. He writes about ideologies he can't stand, like communism, and he describes them as an incurable disease that's going to destroy the nation. So from his perspective, violence isn't about starting a revolution. It's more like a form of self-defense. It's enacting justice to protect the nation from traitors within.
This is a really telling example of who he's reading and who he's influenced by. To get his point across about the kind of fanatical resistance he thinks is necessary, he quotes Joseph Goebbels directly. He uses this quote to frame his own position as a noble refusal to surrender to a corrupt and dying system.
All right, so if the modern world is torn down, what does Ransom want to build in its place? What's the ideal society look like for him? Well, you can't separate the politics from his spiritual beliefs, and you definitely can't separate it from his racial vision. He's very, very clear about this. He draws a direct line between his Christian faith and his racial identity. In his view, to preserve what he calls authentic Christianity in the Western world, you have to preserve white people and white cultures. For him, this isn't just about politics or culture, this is a deep-seated theological belief. And his view of religion is, let's just say, hierarchical. It's a pyramid. At the very top, he puts his own orthodox faith, calling it the fullness of the truth. From there, Catholicism is a rival global power. Protestantism is just plain heresy. And that whole modern idea of Judeo-Christianity, he sees it as a completely false concept, designed to weaken Christianity.
Let's dig a little deeper into this race and biology thing. Ransom argues that different races are biologically distinct, and because of that, they actually perceive God differently. So he concludes that to protect a group's unique way of expressing their faith, you have to preserve their genetic integrity. This makes race not just a social idea, but a core part of his theology.
Okay, so we've seen the problem according to Ransom, we've seen his reaction to it, and we've seen the kind of society he wants. So what's the end game? Where is all this headed? What does he think the final solution is? He tackles this head on. Is there any hope left for the current system? Can we fix it? Is there a political way out of this mess he's describing? Can we vote our way to a better future? Can we reform things? Can we, fight our way out? His answer is pretty bleak. He's deeply pessimistic about any kind of worldly fix. He says there's no political solution. We already saw how he rejects voting because it means you're consenting to an evil system. But interestingly, he also rejects a violent solution. He thinks it would be hypocritical for a traditionalist to start a revolution, and anyway, it would be totally useless against the massive power of the modern state.
And that brings us full circle, right back to that quote from the beginning. For Ransom, the answer to total government control to 1984 isn't going back to the founding principles of liberal democracy, to 1776. He sees both of them as just different stops on the same road to ruin. No, for him, the only real answer is a spiritual one. It's a complete return to 33 AD, the moment he believes that capital T truth entered the world. The solution isn't a new political system. It's a spiritual submission. And that kind of leaves you wondering, doesn't it? In a world full of really complex, tangible problems, what does a purely spiritual answer even look like in practice?